In this video, I want to talk about Emile Berliner, the inventor of the gramophone and the gramophone record, the flat disc record. And I want to talk about his first foray into the market with his new invention, the Kammer Reinhardt Berliner gramophone. This is a replica of one here. This is a replica of an earlier model. They made quite a few. So I guess a little bit of history is needed at this point. Emile Berliner was a German-born inventor who moved to the States. He had invented a microphone which Alexander Graham Bell needed to make his phone function a little bit better. So Bell offered to buy the patent from Emile Berliner, and he gave him $50,000 for the patent. Emile Berliner took the money and started a lab where he wanted to work on his new project, recording and replaying sound. At about this time, this is in the late 1880s, and at that time, 1877 is when the first tinfoil recording machine was made. So people had the idea of how to record and how to play back audio had already been established. It wasn't very good, obviously. If you've ever heard a tinfoil machine, they're not really that good. But they do prove the concept works. So around that time, while Edison was working on cylinders, and Alexander Graham Bell founded a company, and they were also working on cylinders, even though both had experimented with flat discs. But Emile Berliner thought, you know what, the disc is where I think I can make some headway. So he experimented in the late 1880s, and at some point around 1888, 1889, he felt his invention was good enough to try it out in the public and see how well it would do in the marketplace. So Berliner went back to Germany, his home, and made contact with the company Kammer Reinhardt, who were well-known doll manufacturers. And they entered into a 3-year exclusive agreement to manufacture and sell records and gramophones. At that point, about I think the production began around 1889, late 1889. So, getting ready to test his idea in the marketplace in 1890, they formed the Grammophon Fabrique Kammer Reinhardt Company, which was established in 1890. At that point, they started making gramophones. The records were manufactured by 2 other companies, and the gramophone started off a lot like this. This is a replica of an early one, and you can see it has a flat disc record. These are 5-inch records. This is not a real Kammer Reinhardt record. They're quite rare and quite hard to find, and I wouldn't even play one if I had one here. This is where you could store extra records. So the records could be stacked up here, and I've got a few replicas of the original disc. This is a replica of one, and I'll hold up a picture in a minute to show you. This is made by Don Wilson, who is manufacturing replicas of these records, and they're absolutely fantastic. So I was able to get a few of those, which means I can now complete this machine with actual proper original style records. I will play the machine in a minute, but I want to talk about some of the different models. So production began in late 1889, and the first ones were like this. There were a few other different ones that you can see, and I'm going to put some pictures up right now. And when you look at these, you can see their slight variations. In fact, considering they're only made till about 1898, there were a significant number of variations, especially ones that were metal-based versions, and I'll talk about that in a moment. This is another Kammer Reinhardt Berliner gramophone. This one is actually an original. Now, the horn and the elbow are paper mache, and this is not the original horn or elbow. I actually made these. But the rest of this machine is original. Again, it has where the records can stack. It's a little slightly smaller base, but it still takes 5-inch records. I would guess that actually this one is probably earlier than the replica over there, if that had been an original. This is another one. It's a replica of the metal-based version. And there have actually been a couple that have been slightly different than this one that have shown up on the market recently. And so we're discovering that there are actually even more variations of this than we had anticipated. So this is, a lot of people have considered this to be the original. I've seen that in books a number of times, but this is actually a later one. Basically what happened was, after the first 2-3 years of production, they decided to focus a little bit more on children's records. And so they came out with a version. They had the original version there, which was a little more expensive, and they came out with a cheaper version that they're selling with children's records. Now, many people treat these or talk about them as if they're children's toys. They weren't. Originally, I think the idea was to sell them as entertainment for families. And the way I know that is, if you look at the selection of records, of which they probably made about 300 titles, what you'll find is there are spoken word, nursery rhymes, there's music, instrumentals, some songs. You've got records in German, English, French, and Italian, and many of those are aimed at adults. So although there are some nursery rhymes and things like that, it's obvious to me that the market was also, they intended to sell for adults. After introducing this into the market in Germany and in Europe, Emile Berliner went back to the US and started manufacturing a few years later larger records, these 7-inch records, and a machine that was similar to the first one I showed you, but bigger to play 7-inch records. Keep in mind, at the time, what was also available on the market? Well, you had cylinders. In 1888, Edison had come out with his wax cylinder. So around the time that these came out, in the early 1890s, wax cylinders were still pretty primitive. They were not mass-produced. They were sometimes dubbed, but the quality wasn't really that great, and many people listened to those records with hearing tubes, so they weren't even loud enough in some cases to project and play to a group of people. The other thing is, Emile Berliner realized the huge advantage he had was, once he was able to make this record, he could make a copy of it, a master, and then he could make a stamper, and from that he could stamp out multiple copies. And so the idea was he could mass produce records, and that was not possible at that time for cylinders. That didn't come up with cylinders for 10 or 15 years. So he had a huge advantage over them. The disadvantage, the cylinder people would like to point out, was that you couldn't record on this at home. But I think Berliner proved that what people really wanted was affordable music that they can hear in their home, and that recording might not be everything that they really want out of a machine. So let's talk about records. What were the records like back then? Well, they weren't great. I mean, they sounded pretty good. Now, I'm going to try and play one for you in a minute. As I said, they were made by 2 different manufacturers. They were 5 inches, single-sided. They didn't have the date on them, unfortunately, when they recorded it. But when Emile Berliner went back to the US and started making 7-inch discs, those discs had that information of the recording dates, which is kind of great for researchers, but not so great for us with the early records. So let's take a look at some records. I'm going to put a couple on the screen and show you. A lot of these records were, as I said, they're very hard to come by. What's really sought after are the original zinc ones that were made. The original record was recorded by etching it into a zinc disc. And surprisingly, you could actually purchase zinc discs of some of the records. So it was like a one-off, which I'm surprised that when you can manufacture hundreds of them from one, that you would actually go through the trouble of recording a single disc for a premium and selling it. But they did that, and those are exceedingly rare. Okay, so let's hear a couple of these. This is one of Don Wilson's replica records, so it sounds probably pretty similar to what an original one would have sounded like. This is another one of Don Wilson's records, and it's actually record number 26, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And the voice on the recording is actually that of Emile Berliner himself. So that gives you an idea what it sounds like. There's a little bit more to the record, but I thought that's all I'll play. This is a musical selection, and the record was made on blue plastic instead of the usual black. The original records were black, and some of them faded to sort of like a dark brown. But we'll hear it on this machine, this replica. So as you can probably tell, I'm pretty passionate about these early gramophones. I find them really fascinating because it's the dawn of disc record technology. I was so fascinated by it, I actually ended up writing a book. My book, Emile Berliner and the Kammer Reinhardt gramophone. When I made this video a month ago, I didn't have this machine at the time, so I thought I would add on to the end of the video a little bit about this new machine I got yesterday. About 6 months to a year ago, a new Kammer Reinhardt phonograph was discovered, an original one that no one had ever seen before. And I wrote an article about it in the spring 2021 issue of the Antique Phonograph News, and the British Club also wrote an article about this machine. And a friend of mine in England actually made 2 replicas of that machine, and this is one of them. I was able to get it off him. And it's a beautiful little machine. It's a little bit different than the other metal-based versions that I showed you. It has a flywheel here to drive, a wheel over here that turns the turntable. And it's a little bit different arrangement here. And the bass has a little cutout, as you can see, for it. It's a beautiful little machine, and it's my most recent addition. Beautiful. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.